Hello and happy Wednesday. I'm pretty sure it's Wednesday. It's getting hard to keep track. So, today we are continuing to talk about studying and planning for exams that are coming. And again, especially open book type exams, because those are the ones you're most likely to be taking right now. Although, depending on what you do, you need to have some kind of external plan. So, as a note, some of the things that might be happening with those online exams is that they're likely to be timed, which means you can't look up absolutely everything. There's a very high possibility that your instructors will use what are called lockdown browsers, meaning that to take the exam, you can't go anywhere else on the computer. I think that's pretty legit as well. What that really forces you to do, though, is make yourself a good physical compendium of what you need, as in notes on paper or in a book. So when you're going back through things, if you're dealing with terms, make sure you've got terms written out, alphabetized somewhere useful so you can look them up as needed. And again, that you're not like looking up a term as if you've never heard it before, maybe just trying to remember a detail of it. So I think today we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of the more aspects of pre-prep. So the first 2 days were how do we remember everything? Today is more like you've got an exam coming up in like 2 or 3 days. How would I prep for it to make sure I knew where I was? I want to go back to that plan concept. Make sure you know what's coming. What kind of exam is it? Is it mostly multiple choice, true, false type answers? Is it going to be an online, very much like fully online type of test where everything's going to have a click answer to check? That's important. You got to know what you're looking for. In those cases, having the reference material is useful, but also knowing it is important because you're likely to have to make decisions between things that are very close, especially in multiple choice. Things will be like one word off or something like that, and that'll be the key. So keep an eye on things that are tricky, terms that are similar, words that are the same, things that you'd be looking for. Keep those mnemonic devices handy because they'll help you remember things fast enough to be able to go through a question. If you know what 4 things you're looking for, you might know which one is not one of them. If you know what the steps are supposed to be, you can put them in order. If what you're going to have to do is problem solving, that's going to be, again, a very different kind of thing. And most likely for problem solving, you're going to have to do something where you can, in some manner, show your work. So be prepared to have your steps sorted and know what steps they are. If what you're going to have to do is going to involve writing down and then sending that so that they can see your work, be prepared to have that way. Or again, if it's online, it's always a little bit hard to say exactly what that's going to be like. If what you're going to have is essay-based stuff, which is also a very real possibility, especially for take-homes, because they expect you to have a little more time to think through them, what you really want to do is have a plan for how to answer an essay type question in a fairly short period of time with the information that you have. So again, you go back to the information, make sure you know enough of it so that you could come up with an outline off the top of your head without having to look up the details. So if you know the basics of a question, I probably did this a lot in the very few history classes that I took, but I did take at least one history-based course in college. And I remember this concept where you had to like know how things would back relate to basic eras or major events or what something would lead to. And you don't need the details, but you know how to do that. And so practice taking those large scale concepts and writing like a mini outline of them. Maybe if you have a bunch of those ready too, you could pre-prep for what you're doing. By the way, the number one way to be ready for a test is to have an idea of what kind of questions they might be asking. Usually by this point in the semester, this point being the end, you have an idea of what your instructor is like and what kind of questions they ask. They've probably talked to you about stuff before. They've probably mentioned the way they work. You've probably taken their tests before. It is worth spending a little bit of brain power to say, if I was this person, how would I word a question on this test? Or what kinds of things would I ask? What have I emphasized and thought was important in class and would put forth? So I always like it when my students can sort of out Doc B me. They can figure out, well, oh, that's the kind of question Doc would ask, or oh, that's the kind of thing you would say. And sometimes I point them out to them. I don't know if they all catch them, but I do try to point them out. I was really good at this back in grad school. I got to the point where I could nail most of my instructors and up to and including my doctoral advisor who asked a question during my oral examination that was dead on to something we had practiced earlier. And it was like, This is great because I know the answer to this. And in fact, a couple of my advisors were like that. So even though one of them went off the beaten path and asked me at least one question that was like, that he had specifically said he would never answer, he did also ask one that was so dead on that I was like, let me draw this graph for you and show you where it is. So grab those pieces of information, the ones that come up over and over again, the ones that are important. In my class, it would be things like inflammation, negative feedback cycles, stuff I discuss over and over. But you can probably figure out from your instructor what to do. So I think that's a key, that a couple days before a test, you do a little bit of that kind of work. Say, what would I do? What kind of prep would that be? Some of this is just the mental aspect of it. You're a little bit less nervous about something if you know a little bit more about what to expect, or you can guess what to expect. I know at our school, especially in math classes, because those tend to be the ones that are real killer, they have lots of old exams that they go over in our learning area, and I believe our online tutors are doing similar things. So communicate with the tutors in the areas. A lot of times they can tell you what kinds of questions to expect. They can't give you the exact stuff, but that's not important. What's important is getting that mental prep in place and knowing what you're going to do. So keep the recall up, but also add in some of these extraneous techniques for figuring out what kind of questions you're going to have a plan to answer them, and be ready to go. Tomorrow, which will be our last day of talking about being prepared for exams, I'm going to talk about literal sort of day of and while you're in the exam tactics, because those are important and they're an important part of your arsenal for figuring things out. Okay. Today's COVID article comes from the New York Times, which I maintain an educational subscription to because I do like their reporting. And in a scientific article sense, this certainly isn't the worst one I've encountered, but New York Times is still the New York Times. They are still a newspaper. They're still trying to sell you something. And in this case, they are still trying to sell you headlines. So the headline is Airborne Coronavirus Detected in Wuhan Hospitals. So first of all, if you've been following anything about science, you'd already know to expect that, because that's literally something that's come up a whole bunch of times, is that when you're in a hospital where people are being treated, this stuff gets everywhere. And that's the way that is. If you are a health professional in a hospital where stuff's going on, you need to have the best protective equipment that there is, and I will never back down on that. Healthcare professionals need everything. It's everywhere. But this is another one of those ones where it's like, but if it's detected airborne, people see the word airborne and go, oh no, I'm in trouble. Here's why you're not in trouble. But also, let's do the science on this. So first of all, their subheadline, while the RNA of the virus was found in tiny droplets in China, scientists don't know if it was capable of transmitting, is better than many I've seen, because they immediately give you the disclaimer, which is, hey, maybe this isn't going to be that big a deal. So I appreciate that. The article itself isn't too bad. The link to the actual article in the journal Nature is right under the second paragraph. Findings were published Monday. And they go immediately to, it's unknown if the virus is infectious. So they have plenty of people who say there's potential for airborne transmission, but not a lot of, detail. The missing piece is viral replication. So I'm going to give the New York Times some props for getting good quotes from people about where the science still needs to go. So although their headline is still kind of like, tries to nail it without it being a thing, it's like, And then they do note very little virus was detected in the air of isolation wards or in patient rooms, which were well ventilated. And so they note the difference of that, which is another thing I've mentioned, that ventilation in open air makes a huge difference. It references some other data, which they reference, which is probably something I've read, but I didn't double check that. They note that none of this is definitive, and they have any quote from somebody who says, I hope we'll be able to start saying something more definitive. Somebody else notes that there were measurable amounts. So I haven't gotten to the paper yet, and this is all the way down at the bottom, but if you make it to the bottom of this article, the one doctor says she calculated it would take about 15 minutes for a person to breathe in one virus particle based on the levels they detected in public places. That's really important, because most of the time, you are not in one spot of a public place for 15 minutes. If the air is moving around you and you have to be in one spot for 15 minutes where that stuff is to get in one particle, which is almost never an infectious dose, by the way, Usually you need an amount, and we don't know what that amount is for this virus. That is a number that is mad tricky to calculate, and honestly is different for different people because it depends on your immune system and things like that. But 1 particle is almost never it. So I'll tell you that. All right, so let's go to the actual article. So I go to Nature, which is a great journal. Doesn't mean I've liked everything they've done. I've torn apart Nature articles before, published and peer-reviewed. But they're a good journal and they do their thing. And they have the PDF, which I have to look at. And excitingly enough, if you scroll down beneath the abstract and the author information and stuff, it's got supplementary information. And it has my new favorite thing, which is not just supplementary tables of data, which I love because I love data. It has the peer review file. So if you want to see what scientists actually do when they peer review data, it's in these files, and I'm going to look at them in a moment. But first, let's look at the actual article. So, aerodynamic analysis of SARS-CoV-2 in 2 Wuhan hospitals. So, you'll notice a huge difference between titles of news articles and titles of scientific articles. Scientific article is like, we studied this thing. News article is like, we found this tiny piece of data that seems really cool. It's an important difference, and you should always read scientific articles considering that. So this is just aerodynamic analysis. It doesn't imply they found anything. The abstract talks about the levels. It notes that in majority of public areas, it was undetectable. They found medical staff areas were a little bit different and stuff like that. So it does indicate their sort of abstract conclusion is our results indicate room ventilation, open space sanitation, and proper use and disinfection of toilet areas can limit the concentration in aerosols. That's great. That's actually really useful information. So this is a fully continued peer-reviewed article. It's not a letter to the editor. It's got all the information. It's got a fantastic, well put together pieces of information and a complete introduction explaining how they did things. It talks about higher concentrations. It's still short. It's meant to be, I think, is part of the idea, and it's not separated into pieces at this point, which I don't know. Nature sometimes does that, sometimes doesn't. Every journal is a little bit different. So you kind of have to look in to find the stuff like the methods and things like that. So, so they sampled it. I don't know if it says precisely how. Robust droplet digital PCR-based method. Of course, we're already very familiar with how good we are at PCR. Aerosol deposition samples, total suspended particle samples. So the things that they generally do. And then they did quantification of genetic material. And we're able to at least in these cases, essentially, how many cycles it takes to get copies. Now, those are not precise numbers. PCR is a really funky little bugger. But usually if there's more copies to start with, less cycles are needed for it to double to the right amounts, so you can get at least approximate quantitation, even though it's not perfect. Be clear about the not perfect part. So aerosol deposition samples and all of that stuff. I would like to see their data, which is not in the original article, so I will go to the supplementary information where it concludes a complete version of sample collection, which I think is also important. So they use gelatin filters and fixed flow rate of 5 liters per minute. So they were pulling air through these filters. And I don't see how much air got filtered through, but I'm sure if I read it, I would have that information along with the analysis and then the table of the areas in which they sampled and the number of people that were there. And the sampling duration. Here we go. Sampling period and sampling durations. So they are a lot of minutes. To be clear, sampling duration includes things like 1,200 minutes. They had to go through, again, a lot of air to collect the samples for this, which I think is important. These are very, very spread out in air. And remembering that is sort of a key concept. They also don't have a lot of samples. And so I think that's also important. So now here's the cool stuff. The thing that they submitted, saying what they did, and the peer reviews. So I really, really want to go through the peer reviews quickly, at least go through the general version of it. So it has reviewer comments. It summarizes the key results, which is that there was viral RNA in the air. And this is where the person says that in their interpretation, the levels were high enough in crowded areas to result in inhalation exposure to 1 copy of RNA in about 15 minutes, which again is not much, especially if you're moving through. And then it could be suspended in the air for a few hours. And they do note that the caveat is that they measured RNA. So here are the things I do like. Data methodology sampling is valid. Appropriate use of statistics and treatment of uncertainties. The sample size is too small to allow for statistical treatment. That's an important note. They don't sort of specify that very strongly in the article so much as they just go over it. And then robustness, validity, reliability. It says the conclusions are overstated because of the small sample size, but they're valuable anyway because of the paucity of knowledge about this virus. That's important. The reviewer thinks the conclusions are overstated. I've said that a lot to a lot of these articles, that I think a lot of these are overstated, but that it is important to publish the data despite limitations, which is important for scientists. Scientists need to see data so they know where to ask the next questions. So I do think that's important. And then this author goes through line by line like you normally would. Referee 2, there's usually at least 2 people, sometimes 3, who notes it's a short paper. They note a couple of points that the aerosols in a real setting is important and knowledge is important. The second person does not go through as much detail. I'm much more of the first reviewer in this. I tend to go through a lot more items, although I do like, line 150 sentence makes no sense. I tend to respond to things like that too, like, what are you talking about? Or, oh, I like this one. The fact that the toilet has a high concentration of aerosol is important, but is there evidence that virus is in urine? So they clearly tried to make something a little bit extra. And then what is the evidence that wearing masks had any beneficial effect other than social distancing and satisfying cultural habits? So they must have mentioned that without providing the data, which I've mentioned a few times before. And then there are the rebuttals, in which mostly they agree that this stuff is important, but those things, I kind of want to see their response to some of the other stuff, because you can respond line by line, you can respond in general, you can do a lot of response. They're taking actions of changing some of it, adding a paragraph on the caveats of the study to avoid over or misinterpretation of the findings. So great, they did actually consider these concepts, that this was very limited, and they fixed it. And the New York Times article, I think, took some of that to light. So everybody's been a little bit better on this. Thank you for the reviewers' comments. Too small to allow. And they note that. We followed the suggestions and addressed it in a similar comment. So they added comments back based on what the reviewer says. This is why peer review is important. Because if something is overstated, the authors can go back and say, you're right, let me back down on that. But if something is not yet peer reviewed, they can't do that yet, and it hasn't been done. Scientists are very good at sort of catching each other and going, are you sure about that? And fixing it. So this is great. This is all available information, and I strongly recommend, if you are interested in science, that you go check this out, because just seeing how they did and how they responded to it is awesome. They even note that the presence of it in urine is controversial. They revised some text, and then they note the mask clarifications in revising the statement, including some references that go to it, including one of the ones that I talked about at some previous point, the Trans-Pacific aircraft H1N1. Anyway, so is this good science? Yes, definitely it is good science. Is it useful to scientists? Absolutely, definitely it is useful to scientists, and they should be doing more work on it. Is it useful to you, the general public? Not really. The sample sizes are too small to be generalized to anything. We can't really run stats on it. And at best, it actually seems to suggest that public places, except where they're very confined, like small rooms and toilets, are shockingly safe, because there's not that many virus particles and it would take a long time to get them into the body. So, which is what I keep saying, essentially, and especially when I talk about the physical out of doors. It's like, these are contained public spaces and the numbers are real low. The out of doors public spaces are even lower. So, but I really like going through the process of the science, and I'll give props to the New York Times article on this one for, even though their headline was annoying, not overstating the results. Please, everybody, read past the headlines. Stuff is in there. Read the data. If you're not sure, ask your local scientist. If you don't have a local scientist, I will be your local scientist. Ask me. All right. I hope you had fun with that.